Welcome to the 16th episode of the Rogue Deck Chronicles. My name is Dean, and we have a special guest this week. As I mentioned earlier in the beginning of this podcast, I got into the game because of my brother, and I'm visiting him this weekend, and we decided let's talk about some Pokemon. So, on this week's episode, we have my brother Devin. Why don't you say hello?
Hello, everybody. I'm Devin. I am Dean's brother. Um, I've been doing Pokemon TCG on and off for about 10 years. My first set was XY Fates Collide. I've gone to leagues all across the eastern United States just because of where I was living during the last 10 years. I've competed in regionals, cups. I remember when there were states. I remember when there were U.S. nationals. So I've been around for a little bit, kind of seeing the evolution of the trading card game and how it's kind of changed over the years in terms of its format, in terms of its qualification structures, and just different things like that, which is very interesting to be able to say that I've been able to watch such massive changes within the TCPI structure.
Yeah, so with that, one thing we kind of want to talk about, I think would be nice for everyone to hear, is we kind of want to talk about the history of the game and where certain cards and deck types came from. And spoiler alert, if you thought your deck was an original idea now in the Stellar Crown format, most likely it is not compared to what has been played in the past. So that's what we're going to talk about this week. We got some cards picked out and some deck archetypes that we want to discuss and see how it has evolved in the last 10 or so years. Yeah, we're just going to have a nice history discussion. And like Devin said, he's been in the game much longer than me and John. I came in at the end of Sun and Moon. So I've kind of seen some of these cards, but anything before that, I don't really have experience that much with. I played Expanded, but that's nothing compared to playing a standard tournament back in the XY era. So yeah, we're just gonna talk about some supporter mons, some deck archetypes, and then of course we'll do our rogue deck of the week. So yeah, we're gonna start off with what are some what are some common mechanics that we've seen over and over again. Devin, what have you kind of noticed with this trend that TPCI has made with the cards, or even was it creatures that really creates these cards, right?
Yeah, so by all means, first I want to leave this by saying this is not a comprehensive discussion on this by any means. There are a lot of really good resources out there if you ever are curious on the history of the Pokemon trading card game. There's a lot of really good retro sources out there if you really want to go even further back. My knowledge base goes really at the end of the black and white era all the way to the present game. So that's where I feel more comfortable in being able to explain some of the evolutions of mechanics, of concepts, of repetitive structures. So I definitely wanted to lead the conversation by saying this is not comprehensive by any means. This is definitely the tip of the iceberg when it comes to reviewing the reskin of Pokemon. And I wanted to make sure we are emphasizing the difference between reprints and reskins.
Yeah, there are big differences. Reprints are actual like the same card, sometimes rotted, sometimes not. I think one good example of that is Superior Energy Retrieval. That is a reprint. However, it was eroded when it came out a couple sets ago. That way, you can't use the same card that you discard to get it back, specifically with the energy. Yeah, whatever cards you discard cannot be included with the 4 energy that you get, because a lot of people will try to recycle that way. Nowadays, you can't do that, but back then you could. So that's a reprint versus a reskin. Example would be
another really good reprint that had very infamous errata is was it? It's the Gusting card that now it's a coin flip. Pokemon Catcher.
Pokemon Catcher, yeah.
Pokemon Catcher. Back in the day, Pokemon Catcher was a free gust. You did not have to have that 50-50 chance of a coin flip. Now, if you play the card, there is a chance that you fail the card.
Yeah.
And that is more of a reprint with an Entrada attachment than maybe some of these reskinning of a mechanic or a archetype that saw success at one point. And again, another piece I wanted us to kind of highlight before we start going deep dive into these is that we're only really going to be talking about archetypes mechanics that had success in relative metagames.
Yeah.
There are probably a lot more examples of these reprints, reskins, or even what a lot of people would call spiritual successors that we're just not going to have an opportunity to talk about because really we want to talk about the more obvious examples. So the first thing I wanted to really look at is Pokemon-based support abilities.
Mm-hmm.
So the first one, and kind of we'll go and talk about overall themes, is Pokemon-based supporter search. So the first example of this be way back with Jirachi little e little x. Jirachi was a metal type Pokemon with 70, 80 HP, so it was super searchable in a lot of different ways. And it was just like what we're used to now. When it's played from your hand to your bench, you can search your deck for any supporter you want, reveal it to your opponent, put it in your hand. And that saw some success. It really wasn't super powerful because it was a two-prizer with less than 100 HP. And even back in its meta, that was still super on the frail side. You could one-shot that Jirachi, get 2 prizes, and that was just a feel-bad moment.
Yeah.
So a couple years later, Pokemon reintroduced that card as Tapu Lele GX.
Which, if you play any expanded tournaments or games, you're really familiar with this card. I played this card. I actually still have it in one of my expanded decks. But yeah, it's a great card. Same concept. Has the ability when you play from your hand to the bench, you can look for any supporter card. And it's a little better than the Jirachi EX in the sense that it can actually attack.
Yes.
It's not the best attack, but you can still do decent damage and actually get a couple prize cards with it depending on what your opponent was playing.
Oh, it was definitely not considered a 2-prize liability in any way, shape, or form. So, to give an idea more detail to that attack, it was an attack that did not get multiplied by resistance or weakness, which kind of sucks because it was a Psychic type, and Psychic really had a good place in the metagame for most of Tapu Lele's lifespan in the standard metagame. But it was Energy Drive. So when this card got released, I remember a lot of people being like, oh, it's X-Ball Mewtwo and Jirachi EX into one card, except for it couldn't ramp its attack based on weakness and resistance.
And correct me if I'm wrong, the X-Ball Mewtwo, that was a very powerful card back then, right?
Oh, it was,
from what I've heard.
X-Ball Mewtwo was its meta-defining card. So Mewtwo Wars used to be a very big thing in the Black and White era, where if you weren't playing Mewtwo, you better be straight out countering Mewtwo.
Yeah.
Because it just did so much damage because it was 30 times the amount of energy that both active Pokemon had. And if you were hitting Mewtwo back and forth, you were hitting each other for weakness, and you only had to do 180 damage back in the day. Mm-hmm. That was a one-shot for 2 prizers. Was 180 damage. And if it's a 30 multiplier, that's just 6 total energy. And DCE was a thing, and Energy Ramp was a thing, with Turbo Dark, and so X-Ball Mewtwo was a big deal. So when Tapu Lele came out, and everyone's like, oh, this is a little bit of a muted version of X-Ball Mewtwo, but it had this come into play mechanic that a Jirachi EX that everyone just felt bad playing. Everyone goes, this is a must-have card.
Yeah.
And it was. It was a 4 of in a lot of different archetypes. If it wasn't a 4 of, it was a 3 of. Every deck played it. Because every deck can take advantage of it because it was a colorless attacker. So we saw a spiritual successor already once with the Tapu Lele from the Jirachi. And then again, this mechanic, this support mechanic, really, this Pokemon support, got reprinted again. Lumineon V is that. Now, it isn't as good of an attacker. It has niche.
You actually never attack with it. Yeah. It's very rare you attack with this card.
Absolutely, but put it onto the bench, get a supporter of your choice. It's Ultra Ball, Luminion V for whatever supporter you need. That's a classic. That's perfect,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something that it's been within standard for years. Um, I know there's a lot of interpretation when it comes to expanded that sometimes you shouldn't have all. If you're going to have one of them, have one of them. Don't have all of them. But I guess that's more of a expanded art metagame rule set that will be cleared out eventually.
But you don't really see that in the expanded because one of the shops that John and I go to frequently, we play it as an expanded night, and you see people playing. Not necessarily we're talking about like Lele and Luminion V, but there's other mechanical cards that we'll talk about in a bit that they play one of, and it's of both, which is actually this could be a good transition. They played Dedenne GX and Crobat V,
Yeah.
which are draw support Pokemon. So, yeah, let's kind of make that transition. How have we seen the draw support Pokemon evolve in the different metas since Black and White, really? Because really, yeah, Devin made the distinction. He only knows really about Black and White on, but that's what most card pools are. Anything before Black and White is considered unlimited, and not a lot of people play that type of format. So we're going to keep with Black and White on for just the discussion of this podcast. If you want to learn anything more about cards printed before that, there are websites out there. There are resources out there. I would just encourage you all just do some research, see if you really are interested in the history of different mechanics from way back in the day. There's a lot of nice research, and it could be helpful for you to know this, especially as we continue this progression with Pokemon. Like, we're going to see these mechanics come again, and the more experienced players know this, and they see this when they make new decks.
Oh, absolutely. So when it came to Pokemon-based draw, there's two different types of Pokemon-based draw. There's the coming into play effects, and then there's this once per turn bench support draw.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll talk about the coming into play effects first. So the most infamous version of this is Shaman Big E Big X. And the reason why I'm saying Big E Big X is because there is a difference between that version and that era's EX and the EX of modern day, because it's little e little x now.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a little e little x back during the platinum era. So again, that's pre-black and white, so we don't have to worry about that as much when we're talking about expanded and standard metas. But that's why you're going to hear me say that difference, because they are two different types of cards.
Yeah.
So Shaman Big E Big X had an ability that when it came from your hand to play, you draw until you had 6 cards. And you could do that every single time Shaman came into play from your hand. There was no limit to that ability.
So, was there a way to recycle a single card?
Yes.
And do it over and over again?
Yes. Acerola. You had Scoop Up Cyclones. You had Super Scoop Ups. Now, Super Scoop Ups were a coin flip, but Acerola was your supporter for a turn. You had the Super Scoop Up Ace Spec,
which we see now, because that's a reprint, like we said earlier. Like, you can actually play the old Super Scoop or Scoop Up Cyclone from back then in your current standard decks, kind of like with the Master Ball. You're allowed to do that. They made that distinction when these cards were announced. But yeah, like the fact that you have all these options to recycle one Shaman EX.
And most decks ran 3 to 4 of them. So it was not unheard of when Shaman was standard legal that a player would go through 45 cards in the deck in a single turn because they were able to Shaman loop so many times.
That's just crazy.
And there was a lot of cards, and we'll talk about some of the archetypes that may have benefited from that in a little bit because these standard eras overlap quite significantly.
Yeah.
But that's part of the reason why Shaman's banned and expanded now. Shaman is no longer viable in any format because it is that broken. But because of that brokenness, we see the types of text we have in current cards now.
Mm-hmm.
And the next progression to that was the Dedenne GX. So Dedenne GX has the same exact ability except for one important clause. You can only do Dedenne GX's ability once per turn.
Yeah.
So Pokemon realized how busted Shaman EX was, how meta-defining that card was. Because if you were not playing 2, 3, 4 Shamans in your list, you better have had another draw engine. And I remember when I was playing that era, I played a Xerneas Gardevoir Lugia deck. So it was Xerneas Break with Mega Gardevoir EX. And this was the Mega Gardevoir that did more damage based on the amount of Fairy Energy in the play. With a Lugia EX that are able to do more damage based on... I did more damage if a Stadium was in play, but also did more damage based on how many energy was attached to it. So I built a lot of synergy on that in an era that if you were running Shaman, everyone looked at you with 3 heads. I went to a tournament. I got top 4 at the tournament. Everyone goes, "Where's your Shaman?" I'm like, "I don't run Shaman." "How do you set up?" I had 4 Professor Research. I had 4 N. I ran Geomancy Xerneas, so I got my energy out so I didn't clog my deck. You're like, and you do that? Like, legitimately, people looked at me like, how did you run a top 4 deck without a single Shaman? Let alone not a 3-up. A single Shaman. And I just couldn't afford it. I could not afford a $50 card at the time, let alone 3 $50 cards at the time.
Yeah. So the fact that like they saw the brokenness of Shaman, nerfed it a little bit, and created Dedenne GX. I remember playing Dedenne in my list when I first started playing the game, and it was very common in Pikarom, Pikachu's Zekrom Tag Team GX, and just the fact that even just the 1 per turn way of getting more cards, discarding your hand, getting more cards, it was so good. And then you just see the Dene in almost every single deck.
Mm-hmm. And that was only as a one-of. And Shaman had a situation called Shaman looping. So there were in that standard era, there were a lot of decks that couldn't really knock out one-shots. Like one-shot, there were certain decks that can one-shot anything. But a lot of the meta was set up chip damage kind of approaches.
Yeah.
And there was a strategy that it's called Shaman looping. So you just put 2 Shamans in the play. Shaman in the active, 1 Shaman in a bench. That is all you have. And against certain matchups, you just attack for 30. Shaman's attack said, put Shaman and all cards attached to it back into your hand.
That was the attack.
That was the attack. Not go into the deck like Lumineon does. Go back into your hand. All cards attached to it. So there was no discarding. You promote the active, that your bench Shaman to the active, and then you let your opponent go, and then back on your next turn, you put that Shaman back down on the bench, and you just cycle through it. It was a really good counter against Trevenant at the time. Because Trevenant item locked you, and its whole attack was just spreading 30, spreading 30, spreading 30. It really could not one-shot anything.
Hey all you rogues out there, we just wanted to take a quick second to say thank you to our sponsor For Honor and Glory. They are a great support to us and have all the things you need related to Pokemon, Magic, D&D, Warhammer, and more. You can go over to forhonorandglory.com and use discount code ROGUE24. That's discount code ROGUE24 at forhonorandglory.com for 10% off your entire online order. Alright, let's get back to talking about those sneaky decks.
So if you Shaman looped a Trevenant deck, the only way you could lose was deck out.
Okay.
And that prevented, and that kind of helped balance certain parts of the metagame, which is why, again, Shaman was so good, because it was so recyclable. But we talked about Dedenne had a discard your hand, draw 6, and then now we have Crobat V.
Actually, no, it went to Crobat V, now that's out. But yeah, same thing, discard your hand, draw, and those were the cards I talked about earlier. In expanding, you play 1 Dedenne and 1 Crobat, and you can go through half your deck. Since Shaman's banned, you have to find other resources, and these are really 2 good resources. And the Pokemon Company really encourage you to have these cards when they built the trainer toolkits. Those were the promo cards in those things, so Pokemon recognizes the importance of the draw support Pokemon. And now from Crobat V, what we have in our current standard format is Squawkabilly EX, which is nerfed even more by where you can only play it on your first turn. So in most decks now, you play a one of, or maybe sometimes two of, if you really need that draw of the Squawkabilly, and you play with the Nest Ball or a Heavy Ball, you get it from your prizes. And yes, it's a liability unless you can get it out of play. But the concept of going through your deck, your beginning of your turn, and getting the resources you need is so powerful to setting up your board state. And in fact, that Pokemon continues to create these Pokemon like this, so you can get going your first turn, and you're not just like, oh man, my hand is dead. I think Pokemon recognizes the importance of setup when it comes to this game.
And I think they also recognize the error they made with Shaman, where the only way to get Shaman EX was pull it from from a booster pack. Shaman was never available in product outside of a booster pack. It didn't have its own box. It didn't have a tin. It was you pull it or you don't. And the pull rates of its set was really bad. And believe it or not, it wasn't even the chase card.
That was not the chase card.
It was one of the cards, but not the chase card.
Oh, dang.
It was in the same set as Mega Rayquaza.
Ah.
Is it Evolving Skies, I believe?
Evolving Skies is not.
No. I'll double check the name of the set, but it was one of those. In its set, it was
Roaring Skies.
Roaring Skies. It wasn't even the only chase card in its own set. It eventually did get a promo. It did get a promo, but so far late that it was not needed. Like, the setup ability was that busted and that hard to get a hold of. That's why it was a $50 card. But just like you said, Pokemon is recognizing the value of these cards and trying to level the playing field. And I appreciate that so much because, like I said, I couldn't afford three $50 cards back in the day. So I
still can't afford three $50 cards in this day.
So when I was deck building back in the day, I had to be very creative on how do I get the same result differently.
Yeah.
And I really did believe that made me a better deck builder. Made my decks more unique. It gave me a better advantage, but also helped me analyze the metagame better. The other part of Pokemon-based draw that I want to talk about is the support-based mod. So not these one-time and come into play abilities, but these repetitive abilities that can happen. In the first one that comes to my mind is Abysmal Hand October.
Oh yeah.
So Abysmal Hand October is draw until you get 5 cards in your hand. Sounds familiar.
Yeah, it's Bibarel.
It's Bibarel word for word.
Which you and me used today. Before we recorded, we played some games.
And I think the biggest difference, and maybe not even the difference, but how that happened was when October was standard legal in XY Breakthrough, there was ways to get the Remoraid October out fairly quickly. You ended up getting Brooklet Hill. You ended up getting Dive Balls. You had Ultra Ball. There was a lot of supporters that could help get basic Pokemon fairly quickly. So getting the Remoraid out was super easy to do. And you got October out turn 2 fairly consistently. Now, in this current standard meta, it's fairly the same. You have Quick Ball, you have Nest Ball, you have Artazon. So you have a whole bunch of ways of pulling out the base to it. So that is almost like for like the same thing almost 10 years later.
And then also for those, one distinction I want us to make is until now, every card we were talking about were 2 prize cards with a rule box. Abysmal Hand, Remoraid, or October, that's a single prize with no rule box, just a plain Jane card. And if you play the GLC format, if you play Water type, that is in every single Water deck for GLC.
Heck, it was in a lot of decks in its standard life. It is, yeah, I think the biggest drawback to October was its heavy retreat cost, but it also lived in a format that had float stone.
Mm-hmm.
So you weren't really worried about October ever getting stuck in the active because you could just float stone it. And tool removal at the time wasn't the easiest thing to do.
It's still not.
It's still not, but it was one of those situations where you put the October down, float stone it, and you know you're good for the rest of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And you're forcing your opponent, very similar to today, like, do you attack the main threat or do you attack the draw engine?
Yeah.
You force your opponent to make that decision. And sometimes you just say, take the Ultra all day. Draw your cards. I don't care. I will address all your attackers one at a time. Because it's just easier that way. And it was a hard decision for a lot of players to kind of figure out, how do I map my prizes?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's the same thing today. Do you knock out the support mon on the bench, or do you knock out the main threat?
Yeah, like a good example of that with really Stellar Crown is, I would say, the Trap Ghost deck, which we'll talk about in a little bit too, because that in itself is a reskin of an archetype. But with Trap Ghost, you play the Hoot Hoot, which evolves to the Joel Seeker Noctowl, which basically gets whatever you need if you have a Terra Pokemon in play. Or you do knock out the Pidgey, which gives you the Pidgeot EX, which is another way to get anything you need out and play. Or do you just go after the Trap Ghost, which is really the only attacker in that deck? And you slow down and maybe make them discard the bench if that's the only Terra Pokemon in play. But it's like, you're putting your opponent in this situation to make a decision. And that's always been a strategy probably ever since this game was created. Like you make your opponent make these hard decisions, regardless of what Pokemon's in play. It's based on your setup. So now we talked about the history of support Pokemon, how it evolved, the passive ones versus the set once you get them from your hand. How does that impact the history of just archetypes? Like, what type of archetypes have we seen season after season do well?
So let's talk about an archetype that would take advantage of those Pokemon, right? So the first archetype, and I actually just pulled up the Roaring Sky set list as we were talking to kind of show in that Shaman was in the chase card of its own set. Mega Rayquaza EX. That was an archetype that heavily relied on Shaman and other support mons because it did damage based on how many Pokemon were on your bench. And it was paired with a stadium called Skyfield. So your bench was 8, plus your Rayquaza. But you don't do the damage calc with that Rayquaza. So you're doing, if you had a full bench at 30 times multiplier, you're doing 240 damage.
You all see how this is familiar?
For 2 energy.
With last weekend?
Or 3 energy, I'm sorry. It was 3 energy, but it lived in a format that had double dragon and double colorless. So it was only 2 energy attachments. So it's exactly what I said. There is a card that is that to a T. There's a deck like that to a T. Terrapagos. You have 1 attacker, 1 energy attachment to attack. Legit, you're doing this. The only difference is you're not doing 240 because of the limitation of double turbo energy, which in itself is another reskin of double colors energy, but nerfed because double colors energy was so powerful as well. Like, this is Mega Rayquaza all over again, and now I can see, looking at Dortmund, looking at Joinville, you see the experienced players play Trapdos. I can't say this for sure, but it's probably because they play Mega Rayquaza if they were playing back then, and they're already used to this deck. Mega Rayquaza was such a heavy part of the meta share, and I think the biggest difference between the 2 decks, if you really want to nitpick the 2 decks, right? Mega Rayquaza was an evolution deck. Mega Rayquaza was a stage 1, effectively. It was a mega stage, but it was a stage 1.
Mm-hmm.
So you were not attacking turn 1 in any circumstance with this deck. Your first turn was set up, set up, set up. And I say set up legitimately, the ability set up by Shaman. You put 2 to 3 Shaman into play. You put another support mon. You put a backup attacker into play. You attach your Spirit Links, which will allow you to evolve the next turn without losing your turn. Because that was the big mechanic of the time. If you Mega Evolved and you didn't have a Spirit Link attached to the Pokemon, your turn ended. So there wasn't any other tools in that deck that wasn't the Spirit Links. But you had cards like Mega Turbo, which was an energy accelerant just for Turbo Pokemon. Or just for Mega Pokemon. So it was very, very interesting on how those two decks are legitimate. Terapagos is a reskin. It's just a stage 1. This is the only difference. It's a stage 1. Or it's a basic, I'm sorry.
But when you can't attack your first turn, though.
Yeah, it's the difference.
Which is essentially the same as needing to get to a stage 1. Like, it has the same limitations. And looking at the Roaring Skies set list that you have up, I see other item cards that we have now. There's Switch in that set. There's Energy Switch with Trapdos. You don't really see it, but it's there. Skyfield, which is Area 0 Underdefs. You have Double Dragon Energy. Well, we have Double Turbo Energy. Like, it's like almost an Ultra Ball. Like, there's so many cards that we have either the same or similar in our current format. Right in Wally.
Mm-hmm.
Like Grant said, we don't have
you
a
could
card like
Wally, you
but
could
we have
Wally,
Grand Tree.
You could Wally Omega, but it.
This just shows how cards are reskinned over and over again. Like, we have a lot of those cards in our format, just in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's where even when like Pokemon announces new sets, they really try to push 1 or 2 archetypes to us, saying, "Here's a new set. Here's the archetype within the set." Roaring Skies was, "Here's Mega Rayquaza. Have fun." And you just kind of built everything. Like, you could buy 2 to 3 booster boxes of Roaring Skies and have a Mega Rayquaza generally.
Kind of like with Stellar Crown, you can probably buy 1 or 2 booster boxes and have most of Tropicos. You'll probably be missing some of the Tropicos cards. But, like, I'll be honest, I pull 3 between going to buying a booster box or going to pre-releases and even just getting a Stellar Crown for, like, going to a tournament. Yeah. Like, I pulled a Tropicos in a pack that I just bought over the counter.
Exactly. And that is, again, whenever like you ask me, "Oh, what do you think of this card?" And a lot of times the first thing that comes in my mouth is, "Oh, that's X."
And then I look at you funny. I'm like, I don't know what that means because I haven't been around the block as long as you.
So I never see a card as a new card anymore, which is horrible to say. But for the health of a competitive trading card game, sometimes you just need to recycle your ideas. You don't always have to create brand new archetypes over and over and over again. I think that's what makes Pokemon and any other TCG, Magic, Yu-Gi-Oh, etc., a healthy thing, because it allows for some ingenuity, but allows for that, "Oh, I had this experience with this." It keeps an older player engaged because they don't have to try to relearn every single set.
Mm-hmm.
Another archetype that was ultra successful in the when I was playing was Night March. And for those who don't know what Night March is, it is a deck that did damage based on how many Pokemon with the attack Night March was in your discard pile. And your main attackers were Joltik, Pumpkaboo, and then in its later iterations, you threw in a Machamp Marshadow GX just for something that had more than 70 HP. Every single Night Marcher was super frail, but they were all single prizers. And the Night March archetype had a lot of cards in the format that allowed you to search cards out and just put them into your discard pile.
Battle Compressor was one of them.
Battle
right?
Compressor. Search your deck for three cards and put them in the discard pile. You search your deck for 3 Lampins because you'll never be able to play the Lampin. And you just Lampin automatically with just 4 cards you put in the discard pile. That was 80 damage right there. And you were attacking for a double colorless energy, and you were doing 200 damage. And Joltik could hit Shaman for weakness. So you only needed like six Night Marchers in the discard pile to one-shot a Shaman for 2 prizes. If you needed more, you just kept on dumping more, and you would legitimately just attack with a Joltik jab. Attack with a Pump if you wanted a Psychic weakness. It also lived in a format where, what's the Psychic Stadium?
Oh, I can't remember.
It's a Psychic Stadium that they decrease Psychic type attacks by 1 colorless, and it turned
Dimension Valley.
Dimension Valley. It turned Pumpkaboo's triple colorless attack cost to a double colorless attack cost. So, because it was one pricing, it didn't matter you one-shotted it. They had 70 HP. Your opponent was, okay, let me one-shot you, and then they're like, cool, you have an EX for 180, 200 HP? I'm gonna respond back and get 2 prizes for that. They
Yeah.
didn't care. They absolutely didn't care. But the biggest reason why I'm bringing up Night March and kind of painting that scene, right, is because it's been redone multiple times in the last 10 years.
Oh, yeah. Even since I've been in the game, you have Night March, and then you had Lost March, which all they did was replace the word night with lost.
And you did that in what was in the Lost Zone instead of your discard pile, which was a little harder to manage. The Lost Zone was a very different zone to manage, but it came in a set that really wanted you to manage the Lost Zone.
And we're not even talking about current stuff. We're not talking about the whole Lost Box era, which we're in right now. Like, there was a time where Pokemon wanted you to interact with the Lost Zone. It was like, what, 5, 6 years ago?
Yeah.
And now we're kind of, even that in itself, it's coming back. The fact that there was a set that Pokemon really encouraged you to manipulate the Lost Zone.
They went almost 15 years. They went from like the Platinum era to Heart, Soul, Gold, Silver era to then. It was almost 15 years. They didn't touch the Lost Zone for all Black and White and for all of X and Y. They went through a lot of sets before revisiting that mechanic. In the sort of is Unified Wings still standard legal?
It is actually.
So Unified Wings is Night March, just reskinned, but it's not nearly as strong because of Power Creep. That's the biggest thing. Is some of these older archetypes are not as strong as they used to be because the HPs have grown so much.
Yeah, but with Unified Minds, what's making it okay. So I want to say it's okay. It's not the best deck. Granted, we did have Alex Szymanski, day 2 at I think NEIC 2 years, not this past season, but the season before that, with Unified Wings. Like, he already had his world invites, like, he was set. So he showed up and got like top 32 with it. And the reason why it was so good, and it probably is kind of good now, is the weakness mechanic. It hits into the major weaknesses.
And that's what Night March really loved. It hit a lot of Pokemon for weaknesses. And could it one shot without it? Absolutely it could. But it didn't have to all the time.
Yeah, because if you're using up all your Pokemon.
Mm-hmm.
It's not sustainable versus now. Like, if you want to hit Lugia, you hit with Kilowattrel. If you want to hit into the Gardevoir, you hit with the Murkrow. Now we have the Dartrix. Hit into Roaring Moon and Charizard EX. Like, what saves it is the whole weakness of the current meta. If those weren't the big cards right now, I would say it's not a viable deck to play at any tournament.
But here's the thing, I think a lot of players don't give Pokemon in their research department enough credit. It's not a coincidence. Nothing that you said in terms of the type mechanic, the weakness triangles, are a coincidence. It knows what's going to be strong in its metagame. So when they do develop these sets, now by no means have I ever been through these meetings or anything, but there's no coincidence that there's counters to everything.
Oh yeah.
So when these different mechanics and these different archetypes come into play, they're doing it very intentionally. They're trying to create that balancing point. And these rogue decks, these meme decks, they exist for a reason. And these archetypes get repeated with different skins and different typings for a reason. And that's always very interesting because, just like you said, we have all these decks running wild. Why don't you try this small, fun archetype and see what happens?
And it's cheap deck to make too. These cards are not expensive.
They're all common and uncommons, effectively. Yeah. And that's, again, it helps budget builders succeed so much more. Because yes, Pokemon is not known to be an expensive game. It's not Magic the Gathering by any means. And I say that because I play Magic. I know my budget when it comes to my Magic cards. And knowing that if I wanted to build a couple decks in Pokemon, I could. It helps a lot. Another kind of reskin of this type of archetype that we're talking about to kind of continue that Night March theme was Mad Party.
Oh, yeah.
I actually played that deck and qualified for several events
Yeah, you're
with
up.
that.
Yeah, you qualified on the team challenge with me playing that while I was playing Archdrowdon.
Hmm.
And yeah, it's basically I love it. It's so much like Night March because the attackers were so frail.
Yeah.
Like to a point where you stare at it and you get a knockout.
And that's the beauty of that type of archetype. It's everyone's like, oh, I need to get this attacker. I need to hit the 200. I'm like, go ahead, hit 200. You're knocking me out 5 times over, but you're only getting one prize for it. I'm gonna return KO for 2 to 3 prizes, and even if it takes me 2 turns to rebound, I'm still even in the prize trade.
Yeah.
And that's why it was so successful, is because it just lived in a multi-prize card meta.
I think that also was around when we get 3 prizes too.
It was.
So sometimes you got 3 prizes and they're still only getting 1.
Yeah. And if say it's I missed a turn, I'm still ahead. That's why it works so well, because you just have to make those decisions within the meta that they exist in. And then the last example I want to give on this kind of archetype before we kind of move on is Ancient Box.
Oh yeah,
Ancient Box is it's not the same as Night March. The Night March was at Pokemon based power. Ancient Box was power based on a certain mechanical card
Mm-hmm.
in your discard pile. In this case, ancient cards. Very similar to how Rapid Strike Pokemon, like Rapid Strike Malamar, you needed so many Rapid Strike Pokemon in your hand, and you ended up getting rid of those for that attack. That they produce these subsets effectively within their sets: Rapid Strike, Single Strike, Fusion Strike, Ancient, Future cards, and they want you to kind of use those mechanics, and they will feed you. I'm not going to say force feed you. They will legitimately, it's a baby. Here you go, have fun, and you kind of have to figure out what they wanted us to do with it.
Yeah, I remember I was watching one of the regionals, and one of the casters, they made a comment, kind of like we were saying, like Pokemon gives us the tools to do stuff, and it's up to us to kind of discover how the tools are used most effectively. And they were saying, yeah, one of the there is a team that kind of play tests everything and makes sure the cards that they create are going to be used, and they have an idea of how to use them. And they made a comment saying that it took us 2-3 tournaments to put Mirage Gate in a Lost Box deck. It was supposed to be in these decks the whole entire time. And if you look back to the first couple of regionals, no one used Mirage Gate. It took us 2 tournaments to realize, oh, this is actually a good busted card for this archetype of a deck.
Mm-hmm.
So like you said, like the research team, they have an idea how these decks should be used most effectively. It's just up to us to discover that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I would say with that, in the reskin concept, sometimes it's not even just reskins. Sometimes it is the same legitimate ability recycled on a different Pokemon. Or even on the same Pokemon, just years later.
And we're going to be seeing that soon with Zoroark.
Exactly. So Zoroark, and I say Zoroark, it's Zoroark GX with the ability Trade. Now, we have Trade in the current format. We have Trade Light in the current format. Refinement. It's Trade Light. It's Kirlia. It does trade. It's exactly what it's supposed to do, but it wasn't as strong as Zoroark GX was. But we're getting Zoroark GX back, and it's going to be back in its kind of its natural environment of copying stuff.
Mm-hmm.
With trade. And when Refinement Kirlia came out, I go trade. I don't even call it refinement. I call it trade because it is trade.
Yeah, it's just discard 1, draw 2.
And I know you like no, because when you tell me, oh, we do this the Kirlia, I'm like, oh, the trade Kirlia. I know it's refinement Kirlia in the back of my head, but I don't equate it to that because it is a support-based ability that allows you to breed into a very strong attacking archetype. Zoroark was strong, but it got stronger with partners.
Yeah.
Kirlia is strong. Don't get me wrong. That refinement ability is super strong when used in the right environment.
which was in so many decks too. It didn't have to be in the Gardevoir deck. You saw that just as a draw engine in itself. I used it in my Tatsugiri Dondozo deck to help me get the cards I needed. I didn't play any Psychic Pokemon. I didn't play any Gardevoir EXs. It was just there for a draw engine.
Yeah, and if it gets paired with a strong attack, or even if the ability has an attack that's usable on it, it just amplifies the survivability of a card. When Zoroark GX was popular, the most popular archetype I can think of is Zoroark GX and Decidueye GX. A stage 1 and stage 2 combination that you just drew a whole bunch of cards. You used Decidueye GX's ability to ping damage across the board, and you just hit for 90 on the attack, but you were doing much more than 90 damage a turn. You were drawing up to 6 to 8 extra cards. You were pinging 40 to 60 extra damage before you even did your attack phase. And everyone was, if you weren't running Zoroark, you were hard countering it.
Yeah.
Because it was such a meta-defining archetype. And it had so many different partners throughout the years. Like, it was a common joke when it came to deck building, where someone goes, here's my deck list, and someone goes, remove all these, add a 4/4 line of Zoroark GX, and add a 4, and then you can keep your partner. Like, it was such a demanding card. And they did the right thing by putting in the product.
Yeah.
They made it easier to get a hold of, which was great. But again, it just reskins the same thing. Another famous ability that is support-based but yields to strong attack partners is Rain Dance.
Oh, yeah.
So Rain Dance was in the base set of the game. Base set Blastoise allowed you to play as many water energy from your hand into play as you wanted. And there was Hydro Pump and Water Gun attackers back in the base set. And those attacks basically had a base multiplier of 10 or 20 depending on whoever it was attached to, and more for every water energy attached to this Pokemon. So all the way back in base set, all the way in 1998, this archetype mechanic was born, and it just keeps on living on. It got enhanced, I believe. In my opinion, I think it got enhanced when Archie's Ace in the Hole was viable, both standard and expanded formats, where you didn't even have to run the Squirtle line anymore. You ran a 1 Blastoise, ditched it, Archie Ace in the Hole, put it on your bench, and now you can just legitimately flood, water type pun, flood your board with water energy and just attack, and you have so many of these box water attackers that just did different damage based on different energy requirements for water.
Mm-hmm.
So it was very interesting to see that, and then obviously we have that in the current format, just reskinned in a different way.
Yeah, we have Super Cold with the Baxcalibur. It's legit the same wording, like attach as often as you want. You like water energy to your Pokemon. Obviously, we see it paired with the Gen PAL deck right now, but you can make the same argument. Any deck that plays water energy, and you can, if you need a Hydro Pump like attacker, you can do that. There's actually the new Lapras EX, the Stellar card. Granted, a lot of people say it's a bad card, which, yeah, it's not as strong as the other Stellar EXs right now, but it does have that attack. So you could legit pair Super Cold Baxcalibur with that Lapras and do a lot of damage.
I would say if it wasn't a 2-prizer, that card's going in there 100%.
Yeah. So we see a lot of energy flood decks. Just we have that. I know we were talking about how just during the tag team era, you had the Magikarp Wailord, which had a similar attack as well.
You needed I want to.
It's like 8 energy or something for the GX attack. It was bonkers. Like, no one really played it, but when it was actually a fun deck.
Yeah, I want to see, because it had an absurd energy requirement. You're 100% correct. Tower Splash. If this had at least 7 extra water energy, so I needed 8 total energy attached to it, this attack does 100 damage to each of your opponent bench Pokemon.
So it does 10 base and then 100 all your bench.
Yeah, 100.
So if you can set up the game to where that can knock out the multi-prizers, you won right there and then.
Yeah,
and it's surprising to me too. Like, we just pulled that card up. We pulled up the old art. It's $200, and it was not a good card, and it's $200.
Yeah, and it's mostly because it's such an old card, but it's also a staple in some decks. Like, if you want to play Expanded and you want to play Water Expanded, Archie Ace in the Hole, Blastoise, Rain Dance, that's a very solid card archetype.
Yeah.
It will never go away. It's so good because water art support is just always there. So, but that's, again, we go back to the point, right? It's nothing ever is brand new in Pokemon. I do a lot of Pokemon Go content, and it's a running joke in Pokemon Go that there's a lot of FOMO in Pokemon Go, the fear of missing out.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, just wait, it'll come back. If you have to pay for it, just wait, you'll get it for free. TCG is the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
It'll come back. It'll come back, and just pay attention to what it's going to look like. It's going to have a different bow on it.
Yeah.
It's going to have it's going to have a different face, but it will always come back. And I say that because the day before we started recording, you text me a message, goes, hey, Scramble Switch is coming back. I'm like, cool. Who's going to be the next Primal Groudon? And you're like, what? I go, yeah. Scramble Switch was only good with Primal Groudon because it was the only archetype at the time that utilized it very well.
Mm-hmm.
And for those for those who weren't around, Primal Groudon EX was a Mega Groudon card, so it was a Mega iteration, and it was for 4 energy. It did 100 base, and then 100 more if there was a stadium play, and then you discard the stadium. And then it had a retreat cost of 4 and had a HP of 230, which at the time was massive.
So, I know we talked about this card, and it just hit me. That is Roaring Moon GX, or EX right now. 100 and 120 if you discard a stadium in play. That is legit Roaring Moon EX right now.
But what's the energy cost for that attack?
3 darkness.
3 darkness.
So it's a little easier to set up, and it's a basic. But even that attack is recycling old cards.
Yeah. And Pokemon, like I said, it will be too hard on the research team and just the developers of the actual mechanics of the game. Don't get me wrong. Creating 200 plus cards every single set is hard. And if we put the pressure on the artists to just create new cards for us, it'll make it easier. And then they just R&D the same things over and over again. That's fun.
Yes.
So it's one of those situations where it's really, really kind of cool to see. And I'm honestly excited to see what happens going forward. And with that, I know part of what you wanted me to do is create, or kind of like, hey, what deck would you play?
Mm-hmm.
And when the new set came out, I kind of did some research, and the deck I kind of gravitated toward was Galvantula GX, or EX, sorry. And it's because I love item block. One of my first decks I ever played was Trevenant. It was ability-based item block. So, I did a little research, did a little testing with you before recording, and I want to go over, I guess, the rogue deck of the week, I guess, if that's something you want let me to kind of talk about a little bit.
Yeah, so as we mentioned, this week we're gonna talk about the Galvantula EX. We mentioned it in our Stellar Crown review episode. For those who are not familiar with it, since we haven't really seen it in tournament play, it is item lock. So even with the theme of this episode, item lock you've seen it in so many iterations. Devin mentioned in the old Trevenant, a common card that people first think of is the Seismitoad. So I remember playing my first tournament. We were in an expanded shop at the time. This person played Seismitoad against me, and it destroyed me. And now Galvantula EX was printed in Stellar Crown, and it does the same thing. So, Devin, if you want to talk about how the deck worked for you, what it does, basically the concept and the support model with it that made it work. Because you were able to get item lock on me 3-4 times in a row.
Yeah.
Even in a turn where I thought I checkmated you. Granted, I still had you, but you made me work for that win.
Yeah, absolutely. So Galvantula EX is a Lightning Terra Pokemon. It is a Stage 1. Has 260 HP and has 2 attacks. So the first attack is Charged Web. and it's for a Lightning Carlos. It is 110 base, and then if your opponent's active Pokemon is an EX or a V, it does another 110. So that's 220 if you're attacking into an EX or a V, which is great damage for certain things. But really, the Galvantula attack that I was focusing my deck around is the Fulgurite attack. So Fulgurite does 180, but here's the kicker. The attack cost is Grass, Lightning, Fire.
Yeah.
So it's a very hard attack cost to get into play, but the payout, I think, is worth it. So you discard all the energy. Again, a hard attack requirement. But during your opponent's next turn, they can't use any items. Again, item lock. It's one of those, I may not knock you out. Ideally, goal would be to try to get a knockout and item lock in the same turn. That would be fantastic, but it's not always going to be doable.
Mm-hmm.
And really how I'm getting that to be recyclable and streamlined is that you're using the Joltik from the same set. You're using the Joltik that has a colorless attack that says search your deck for 2 lightning and 2 grass and attach them to your Pokemon any way you would like.
Mm-hmm.
The other partner Pokemon is I'm experimenting with the Chansey Blissey combination right now with the
Happy Switch,
where I can move 1 energy from one Pokemon to another once a turn. And kind of seeing if I can just Glass Trumpet onto the Blisseys and then move that up to a Galvantula and attach. If I get a Sparkling Crystal, I only have to do one less attachment, which will help kind of some of the synergistic pieces.
And remember, with Happy Switch, it doesn't have to be from the Blissey to another Pokemon.
No, it doesn't. It can be from any Pokemon.
One Pokemon to another. Yeah, so that's a big distinction because you don't have to Glass Trumpet to the Blissey. You also play Bibarel, and we actually added one of the Skwovet with the Nest Stash.
Yeah.
So you have a lot of colors Pokemon for targets, and then you're just trying to get the Galvantula. And like I mentioned earlier, I thought I had him. I'm like, oh, I'm going to get his Pokemon out and play. He has no other way to power up this Galvantula. Didn't have any energy in play at all.
No, none. I was living out of the discard pile for sure.
And you were able to Fulgurite me out of nowhere. I'm like, what is this?
And I think there's some small things I would change to the list I'm running right now. I'm less than 5 games into testing, so there's still some things that I want to kind of see if I can streamline or become more efficient. The one thing that we talked about for sure was adding a Silene to kind of help with the Sparkling Crystal play a little bit more.
Yeah.
But I also proved I don't need it. The Sparkling Crystal is a nice little piece to kind of do it if you're kind of struggling for energy. I was able to get Fulgurite from 0 to 3 energy like multiple times in a row.
It was like 3 times in a row.
So the Sparkling Crystal is a nice play. I still think that is the A-Spec of choice that I would run with right now. Until a better A-Spec is coming that would be better for that. Another piece that I saw when I was kind of doing research and I wanted to play around with some testing was the Baby Galvantula.
Mm-hmm.
And that's purely so it can one-shot Charizards. And that would be one of those in-game kind of things that you would do. You would never really want to do that earlier mid-game unless you absolutely were forced to do it.
Because with Charizard, Fulgurite destroys it too because it's so reliant on items. They can't rare candy into what they need. So that will just add another win condition to this list.
Yeah, I think right now the Mew EX I'm not feeling the greatest with, but I understand why I have it there. I just haven't been able to utilize it to its max potential just yet. It's
really a pivot card for you. But the games that you and me played, you didn't need it.
No, I haven't needed it yet, but I understand why it's on my list. But so I'm not sure how you test or anything like that. But when I'm making a list, I have my 60. But I always, in my head, I'm thinking about 5 cards or so that I'm assessing with every single test session. And with that, I also have 5 cards and I'm thinking about, all right, what can I switch in? How can I find my efficiency? And over time, that 5 turns into 4, that 4 turns into 3, to where I find the best 60 for me.
Yeah.
And right now, I'm definitely at I have 70 cards I'm really realistically looking at. 70 spots. And I'm just not quite there to, I think, where Galvantula has found its most efficient potential yet. And I do believe with what a lot of other commentary is about the deck that it can be strong. It just hasn't been optimized just yet, and no one's found the perfect formula just yet.
Yeah.
But it's fun. It's not the most traditional item lock by any means. It definitely is item lock that you have to work for. It is not old school by any means. I enjoy it. Do I think that I can run to a challenge or a cup tomorrow and win with it? No. I think there's still a lot more testing that has to go with this archetype for it to be something that will be impactful to the meta scene. But I think this is a deck that you will definitely make your opponent earn their wins.
Oh yeah.
And that's always something I always strive for whenever I'm picking my decks is I want my opponent to earn it. And I say this because Pokemon's big basic archetypes are things I don't really gravitate toward. I don't really like big like beat stick decks,
which is so common right now.
I want them to try to show me that they can get into their winning situations. And item lock is one of those situations. I'm like, all right, if you're gonna beat me. Do without items.
Yeah.
Or you and I were talking about maybe should I add a hand disruption package or an energy disruption package with enhanced hammer or different things like that to kind of force them to be more than autopilot.
Yeah.
Because that's the one thing that I want my opponents to think they're not just on cruise control. They actually have to engage in the match.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's Galvantula. We'll have the deck lists that we were playing with in the show notes. Be on the lookout. We started a new YouTube series of a rogue deck showcase. So that this could be one of the videos we will record and see how it does on ladder. This was one of the first decks that myself and John also were kind of excited about because we knew not a lot of people were going to play this deck. But it does make your opponent think. So we're excited to see how this deck grows and evolves in this format. But yeah, I think that's all for this week. Sorry for all the info overload. This was a very history dense episode, but it just shows that history repeats itself even in the trading card game.
And it doesn't help that you invited. I actually have a history degree.
Yeah,
my academic background is history. I focused mostly on sports history, but it was more again social commentaries, right? I think the best quote for this session, right, is those who know the past are not doomed to repeat it, or those who do not know the past are doomed to repeat the mistakes.
Yeah.
So if you know how everything has happened in the past, you can prepare better for the future for sure.
And just with this is if you know the archetypes that have done well, you are putting yourself in a good situation when new cards come out, and it doesn't take as long for you to figure it out. So, but yeah, this week's episode of the Rogue Deck Chronicles. Thank you for joining us, and yeah, we'll see you next week.
Have a good day, guys. Enjoy Pokemon. Enjoy your decks. Have a great time.
See ya.
Hey, all you rogues out there. We just wanted to take a quick second to shout out our sponsor and one of our home leagues at For Honor and Glory. They have all you need for your card game and TTRPG needs. Some upcoming events they have are on Saturday, October 5th, the TCG Monthly League Challenge. On Saturday, October 26th, the Monthly Video Game League Challenge. Saturday, October 26th, also a Surging Sparks TCG pre-release, as well as Sunday, October 27th, the Surging Sparks pre-release, and Sunday, October 27th, also the Pokemon Go Cup and Pokemon Go Challenge. Remember, you can always go over to forhonorandglory.com and use discount code ROGUE24. That's ROGUE24 at forhonorandglory.com to receive 10% off your entire online order. All right, have fun playing your sneaky decks.